Hatred is not simply the loud outburst we see in moments of conflict. Anger comes and goes. It can flare up like fire and cool down just as quickly. Hatred, however, is different. Hatred is slow, calculated, and often hidden behind a mask. It's not always visible on the surface, but it quietly corrodes trust, relationships, and even our sense of humanity. Unlike anger, which can lead to reconciliation when processed, hatred festers. It grows in silence, hardens the heart, and creates divisions that last generations. Today, let's uncover 5 signs of real hatred and explore why it's far more dangerous than anger. There's a profound difference between anger and hatred, and it begins with time. Anger is like a thunderstorm. It comes fast, it rumbles, it pours, but eventually the sky's clear. Anger, in its purest form, is an emotion that signals something is wrong. It can actually be useful because it alerts us to boundaries being crossed, to values being threatened, or to wounds that need attention. Once expressed or processed, anger often dissolves. It may leave some traces, but it does not necessarily take root. Hatred, however, is not momentary. Hatred is the decision to keep the storm alive long after the clouds have passed. It is sustained anger that has been fed, nurtured, and watered until it becomes something far darker. Hatred doesn't want resolution. It wants to linger. It doesn't seek truth. It seeks fuel. Where anger can cool down when given space, hatred grows stronger the more space and time it is given. When someone is angry, there is still a chance for repair. Apologies can be offered, conversations can be had, understanding can be built. But when anger hardens into hatred, the possibility of reconciliation shrinks. Hatred refuses to let go because it feels safer to hold on to resentment than to risk being vulnerable again. This is why hatred is more dangerous. It thrives in longevity. Hatred can last for years. It can survive without fresh conflict. It does not need a new wound. It simply feeds on memory, on rehearsed pain, on the refusal to release. It makes people carry yesterday's fire into today's relationships. While anger teaches us about the moment, hatred locks us in the past and robs us of the future. If anger is a spark, hatred is the coal that never cools. It doesn't just burn, it keeps smoldering in silence. And that slow, sustained heat is what damages hearts, destroys trust, and poisons entire communities. One of the most dangerous qualities of hatred is its quietness. Anger usually announces itself. You can see it in a clenched jaw, hear it in a raised voice, feel it in sharp words or heated debates. Anger is often noisy, and because of that, it is visible. We know when someone is angry, and that visibility creates opportunities to address it. People can calm down, apologize, or walk away. There is transparency in anger. Even if it is uncomfortable, at least it shows itself. Hatred, on the other hand, does not always show its face. Hatred often chooses silence. It hides behind forced smiles, polite conversations, or even indifference. And because it hides, it becomes strategic. Hatred is not about release, it is about calculation. It doesn't lash out in the moment, it studies, it waits, it looks for the most painful moment to emerge. Think about the difference. Anger wants to be expressed, but hatred wants to be effective. Anger shouts because it can't hold it in, but hatred whispers because it wants to maximize damage. It may manifest in subtle sabotage, in withholding affection, in deliberate exclusion, or in quiet plans to undermine someone's reputation. The strategy of hatred is what makes it far more dangerous than anger. When anger is released, it can bring clarity. You know what someone feels. But hatred clouds the truth. It doesn't want clarity. It wants control. It thrives in hidden corners where no one can easily call it out. And because it often disguises itself, sometimes as silence, sometimes as false kindness, it becomes harder to confront. The strategy of hatred doesn't just destroy relationships, it erodes trust. Because when someone finally realizes that behind the polite nods, behind the small talk, behind the silence was hate brewing all along, the betrayal cuts much deeper. Anger wounds, but hatred deceives, and deception leaves scars that are far harder to heal. That is why hatred is more dangerous. It doesn't need noise to destroy. It can undo lives in silence. It is patient, it is methodical, and it always strikes when the other person least expects it. And often, that is what makes the damage permanent. There is a crucial difference between anger and hatred, and it lies in what they target. Anger usually reacts to behavior. Someone cuts you off in traffic, lies to you, betrays a promise, or speaks harshly. Anger rises in response to what was done. At its core, anger is about actions. You can be angry at what someone did without believing they are entirely defined by that action. Anger says, I don't like what you did. Hatred goes deeper. It doesn't stop at behavior. It attacks identity. It says, I don't like who you are. I don't believe you deserve respect. I don't think you're worthy. And this is where hatred becomes more dangerous than anger. Because once someone begins to devalue your humanity, reconciliation becomes nearly impossible. You can apologize for behavior, but how do you apologize for simply existing? This shift from behavior to identity is devastating because it strips away dignity. Hatred reduces a person to labels. They are this, now they will always be that. They are not like us. It makes people forget the complexity of human beings and flattens them into categories that can be dismissed, rejected, or even destroyed. Once a person is dehumanized in the mind of another, hatred can justify any action against them. We see this everywhere, in relationships, in workplaces, in communities, even across nations. Anger may create conflict, but hatred creates division. Anger may start an argument, but hatred fuels discrimination, oppression, and violence. Hatred convinces people that they are not dealing with a fellow human being, but with an enemy who must be silenced or erased. When hatred attacks identity, it doesn't just wound the target, it reshapes the one carrying the hate. Because to deny someone else's humanity, you must slowly disconnect from your own. Compassion becomes harder, empathy fades, and the ability to see nuance disappears. Hatred shrinks the heart until all it can see is the worst in others. And this is why hatred is far more corrosive than anger. Anger, if addressed, can create dialogue and growth. Hatred, when it takes root, destroys the foundation of relationship, belonging, and shared humanity. It moves beyond what someone did and begins to destroy who someone is. One of the most frightening realities about hatred is that it rarely stays contained within one heart. Anger is often a personal reaction. You feel it, you express it, and in many cases you eventually let it go. But hatred has a way of spreading far beyond the individual who first carried it. It is infectious. It passes from person to person, from family to family, and even from one generation to the next. Hatred spreads because it thrives on stories of betrayal, stories of injustice, stories of pain. And instead of healing those stories, hatred rehearses them, retells them, and eventually hands them down like an inheritance. A child can grow up hating a group of people they have never even met simply because they absorbed the bitterness that was spoken at the dinner table, whispered in the community, or embedded in cultural narratives. This is how hatred becomes systemic. It is no longer about an individual wound, but about a collective one that is rehearsed until it feels like truth. Unlike anger, which can flare up and subside, hatred feeds on repetition. It grows stronger the more it is shared. When one person carries hatred, they rarely keep it to themselves. They spread it in conversations, in gossip, in teaching, in influence. They infect others with their bitterness until hatred becomes normalized. And once it feels normal, it becomes almost invisible. The infectious nature of hatred explains why conflicts between groups can last centuries, why families can hold grudges across generations, and why entire communities can become divided without even remembering the original offense. Hatred doesn't need fresh fuel. It survives on borrowed pain, carried long after the original wound is forgotten. And this is why hatred is far more dangerous than anger. Anger can be released, processed, or redirected, but hatred mutates. It replicates itself in others. It can turn personal resentment into collective prejudice, private bitterness into public injustice, individual pain into cultural violence. The tragedy is this: when hatred spreads, it doesn't just destroy relationships between people, it destroys the possibility of trust in entire communities. It creates an us versus them mentality, where empathy is replaced with suspicion and compassion is replaced with fear. Hatred is infectious because it doesn't need much to survive. All it requires is silence, repetition, and a willingness to hold on to bitterness instead of healing. And the more it spreads, the harder it becomes to uproot because it no longer lives in one person, it lives in a people. That is why hatred must be recognized and addressed early. Left unchecked, it will not only consume the person carrying it, but also infect those around them until it shapes cultures, generations, and histories. Perhaps one of the most deceptive qualities of hatred is that it rarely sees itself as wrong. Most of the time, anger is easy to admit. A person might say, "I was angry because you hurt me," or "I was angry because something felt unfair." Anger is an emotion that can be acknowledged without too much shame because it is understood as temporary, but hatred hides behind a mask of righteousness. It convinces the one carrying it that their bitterness is not only justified, but even noble. Hatred whispers, "I have every right to feel this way. What they did to me was unforgivable. My resentment is proof that I stand for justice." And once hatred ties itself to a sense of moral high ground, it becomes extremely dangerous. Because when you believe your hatred is righteous, you stop questioning it. You nurture it, protect it, and defend it as if letting it go would betray your very values. This illusion of nobility makes hatred far more destructive than anger. Anger can cool with time and reflection. But hatred that feels justified builds a fortress around itself. Every attempt at reconciliation is dismissed as weakness. Every offer of forgiveness is interpreted as betrayal. Hatred convinces people that holding on to bitterness is a form of strength, when in truth it is a slow form of destruction. We see this not only in personal relationships, but also in families, communities, and nations. Hatred that disguises itself as justice gives birth to cycles of revenge. People convince themselves that retaliation is not cruelty, it is honor. They cloak their bitterness in the language of duty, of loyalty, of fairness. But the truth is that hatred dressed as righteousness only perpetuates harm. The danger is subtle. Hatred that feels justified doesn't look like hate anymore. It looks like principle. It looks like loyalty. It looks like courage. And that disguise makes it even harder to confront. After all, who wants to question their own justice? Who wants to admit that beneath their noble cause lies bitterness that is rotting them from within? And yet, this is the cruel trap of hatred. It convinces people that they are standing tall, when in reality, they are chained down. They think they are protecting themselves, when really they are poisoning themselves. They think they are fighting for what's right, when in reality they are being consumed by what's wrong. Hatred is more dangerous than anger because it doesn't just destroy quietly, it convinces the one who carries it that destruction is honorable. And as long as hatred feels noble, it will never be released. We often talk about hatred as if it's a weapon aimed outward, something we point at others, something that damages them. But the deeper truth, and maybe the most sobering truth, is this: hatred destroys the hater first. Before hatred ever breaks a relationship, it breaks a heart. Before it burns a bridge, it burns the soul that carries it. Before it takes anything from someone else, it quietly robs the one who holds it. And the worst part, it does this slowly, quietly, and often without being noticed until the damage is already done. Anger can shout and slam doors. It can make a scene. It can leave. Scorch marks, but anger usually comes and goes. Hatred, on the other hand, settles in. It doesn't storm through the house. It moves into the basement. It builds a bed. It puts up curtains. It lives there. And when hatred lives in us, it begins to alter the very way we see the world. We stop seeing people as people and start seeing them as symbols of what hurt us. We stop hearing new information and start filtering everything through old wounds. We stop being curious and start being convinced. Hatred narrows the heart. It shrinks our capacity for joy, for trust, for tenderness. It calcifies our emotions until numbness feels safer than vulnerability. It tells us that cynicism is wisdom when really it's just exhaustion wearing armor. And worst of all, it begins to erode our own identity. When we hate someone or something long enough, we start defining ourselves not by who we are, but by what we're against. That is the quiet tragedy of hatred. It convinces us that we are protecting ourselves when in truth we are abandoning ourselves. We think we're standing strong, but really we're standing alone. We think we're in control, but really we're being controlled. We think we're winning, but really we're withering. You see, hatred feeds on energy, and it eats from the inside out. It drains creativity. It steals rest. It makes joy feel suspicious. It numbs wonder. It erodes compassion. And it convinces us that this is just what it means to be realistic, when in fact, it's what it means to be disconnected. It disconnects us from our own tenderness. It disconnects us from others. It disconnects us from possibility. It disconnects us from healing. And here's the hardest truth of all. The person we hate may never even know it. They may move on. They may live their life. They may sleep peacefully at night. But we, the hater, are left tossing and turning, replaying the story over and over in our minds, convincing ourselves that the loop is necessary when really it's a prison. Hatred is more dangerous than anger because it doesn't just break relationships, it breaks selves. And if we are not careful, we will spend our lives trying to punish someone else, only to discover that we have been punishing ourselves. The healing doesn't come when the other person changes. The healing begins when we stop letting hatred define our inner world. The healing begins when we admit, I am tired of carrying this. The healing begins when we ask ourselves, who am I without this hate? And who could I become if I laid it down? Because at the end of the day, hatred may feel like a shield, but it's actually a cage. And the key is always in our hands. Hatred is not simply another shade of anger. It is something far more insidious, far more enduring, and far more dangerous. Anger can flare and fade, but hatred is sustained. Anger can shout in the moment, but hatred is silent, strategic, and patient. Anger reacts to behavior, but hatred attacks identity itself. Anger is usually personal, but hatred spreads like a disease, infecting families, communities, and even generations. And perhaps most dangerously, hatred disguises itself as righteousness, convincing us it is noble, even while it consumes us from within. The truth is this: hatred rarely harms its target as much as it harms the one who carries it. It corrodes joy, it shrinks compassion, and it rewrites the story of our lives in bitterness. It convinces us that we are holding power when in reality it is holding us. This is why hatred must be recognized for what it truly is, not just an emotion, but a poison. And like any poison, the first step toward healing is choosing not to ingest it anymore. Choosing instead to process anger before it hardens into hate. Choosing to confront pain rather than rehearse it. Choosing to release bitterness so that our lives are not defined by resentment, but by courage, forgiveness, and freedom. Because in the end, hatred never builds anything. It only destroys, and the first life it destroys is always the one who carries it. Hatred is not the same as anger, though at